Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 394, Becoming Jewish, Integration. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we are excited to continue our series of episodes about conversion to Judaism, this week with guests Tivona Reith and Holly Smith. We'll dive into our interview in just a moment, but before we begin, we just want to make an exciting announcement that our latest batch of full semester, that's 12 weeks, courses in the Yeshiva have just been announced on our website, and you can register right now. The classes start in October, but you can sign up for them starting now. You can check them out if you head to judaismunbound.com/classes, and we think you're going to be really excited by what you find there. We'll have a lot more to say about this semester's amazing teachers in the coming weeks, along with the fascinating material they'll be diving into, which you can experience if you take those classes. But for now, just head over to judaismunbound.com/classes, and you can check them out for yourself. And now let's get into our conversation. Our guests today, Tivona Reith and Holly Smith, are longtime friends of Judaism Unbound who have been among our most dedicated listeners and also multi-time students in the Yeshiva. Tivona Reith is a retired Jewish and interfaith chaplain who worked for more than a decade in both hospital and hospice settings in the Pacific Northwest. She maintains a private practice called Rite of Passage in spiritual direction, grief and pastoral counseling, life cycle rituals, and Jungian astrology. Tivona Reith also teaches in Jewish and interfaith settings on a wide variety of topics, including death and dying, Jewish mysticism and meditation, Psalms, and Buddhism and Judaism. Before she was called to be a chaplain and pastoral counselor, Tivona Reith spent over 25 years in national environmental and organizational consulting and was also executive director of a nonprofit land trust in Washington state. Tivona Reith's great claim to fame is that she has listened to literally every episode of Judaism Unbound, and it's amazing. Our second guest, Holly Smith, is a queer ritual designer, writer, and future rabbi. She is beginning her first year at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College in Philadelphia this fall. Holly Smith is also a trained creative facilitator with the Jewish Studio Project. We learned about the Jewish Studio Project back in episode 108 when we interviewed its co-leaders, Adina Allen and Jeff Kazowitz. Holly Smith is also the creator of Seder Plate Project on Instagram, where she explores the intersection of earthly and Jewish wisdom as a pathway to healing on personal and collective levels. This is one of those episodes where it's so exciting to have people that we have been in touch with for so long, that we have known for so long, but who we didn't actually know before Judaism Unbound started, who we came to know because of Judaism Unbound, to have them on the podcast. I should say that it was part of the vision of this podcast early on that we would have a lot of interviews with people who were not necessarily leading Jewish organizations, who are just some version of regular Jews. And to some extent, that's something that we have done over the years, but it's something that we're able to do more and more these days because we are coming to know so many more of you through the Yeshiva, through your emails to us from listening to the podcast, and in all kinds of other ways. So keep it up, keep those connections up, because you too may one day be a guest on the Judaism Unbound podcast. And that is true today of Tivona Reith and Holly Smith. So welcome to Judaism Unbound. It is so great to have you on the podcast.
I think we are thrilled to be here.
I agree. We are very happy to be here. Thank you.
I love how that was like a discussion, like that you got each other's consensus about whether you are thrilled to be. I don't think that's ever happened before. We're thrilled to have you and thrilled that you touched base about whether you're thrilled to be here.
Well, this is a really unusual situation in two ways that we're excited to have as part of this conversation. One is that I don't think we have had two guests on before that are on together, but that actually never met before the recording session for the podcast. Because usually when we have two guests on, it's because they're doing something together. They're co-leading some project. And so not only have they met, they know each other very well. But that's not the case in this situation. And the other case that I think is also in a strange way indicative of something to come or something that already is, which is that you are probably two of the guests who have listened to the most episodes of Judaism Unbound prior to being guests. Now, some of that is only because, the later the guest, the more likely they've listened to more episodes because there have been more episodes. But you're among the people that have listened to like most of them, if not all of them. And so the reason I say that that's maybe indicative of something to come is I think it's a statement about what I sometimes struggle to call the community that we're building at Judaism Unbound, because oftentimes the members of the community don't know each other, and yet there's still a sense of being part of something. And we've been working to change that in all kinds of ways, but I still think that there's this element of it's really interesting to have two folks who have never actually met in person or even online, and yet are part of the same community in a really profound way. So I really want to invite you to be almost like fellow co-hosts on this podcast. And if one of you says something that sparks interest in the other one, feel free to ask the follow-up question. You don't have to leave all the question asking to us. I would actually be really interested in the questions that you may have for one another. But just to start with an opening question, and maybe my last question of the hour, can you just tell us a little bit about your story as you like to tell it, about your Jewish story, how it began and how it continues?
Every convert has a really particular story. I don't think there's any one way that people end up starting in one place in their life and ending up Jewish. I started in Arizona, growing up in a Lutheran family. My dad was a Lutheran school teacher, but I knew as early as age, like 9, 10, 11, there's this faith development stage called the 11-year-old atheist, and I think that's what I was, that Christianity was not my truth. However, a 10-year-old understands that it just wasn't my truth. But I'd also had experiences growing up in Arizona of attending Hopi rain dances, and there was something. So I always knew there was something. I wasn't finding it in Christianity. So when I left home at 17 to go to college, I kind of left the church. I left all of that behind. I spent about a decade reading everything I could read about that something. What was it? Every tradition that I could read a book about, I tried to read a book about. And then in the late 70s, I ended up at Indiana University in Bloomington doing graduate work in Chinese studies. Bloomington had this thriving Taoist and Tibetan Buddhist community in that little college town. And it was the first time in my life I felt that I saw people living what they said they believed. And it was transformative. And from that point then, I did about 25 years of Buddhist meditation practice. I never took refuge in the Buddha. I never converted to Buddhism or called myself a Buddhist, but I did Buddhist practice. And then in my mid-40s, I met my husband, who's a born Jew. And we were married under a chuppah by Rabbi Alan Setcher, who to this day was probably one of my entry points into Judaism. We had a Buddhist Jewish wedding. And then a couple years after we were married, I got this nudge to explore Judaism. My husband is a born Jew, but had not set foot in a synagogue since he was bar mitzvah. So it was not important to him that I wasn't Jewish. But when I got this nudge to explore Judaism, he was a little deer in the headlight, like, what? So we ended up starting doing Shabbat and found a synagogue. It was Reconstructionist Synagogue, was a member there, and I converted after being a member there for 3 years. So I didn't convert from Christianity. And in some ways, I don't even feel like I converted from Buddhism, because I really do feel like I live a kind of Jubu, Jewish Buddhist life in an integrated way.
So I grew up in San Francisco, and my family was, I guess I would call secular Christian. We would get a Christmas tree and do presents, and we would find eggs at Easter. But at the same time, it was it felt important in my family to learn about religion and to just be as part of a well-rounded education to like understand religion, but very much as like an intellectual exercise or as part of like just understanding human beings and the world. I didn't feel like I had any particular faith tradition growing up, but I do remember feeling from a very young age that there was an interest in spirituality and a feeling that there was something unknowable greater than myself. That notion of an 11-year-old atheist, I don't think I ever had that experience because around that time, there were two things happening in my life. One was that I was discovering Wicca and neo-paganism, and that really was like a core of my spiritual identity for a long time. So also around that time, I started going to seders with one of my best friends, and these seders were just unlike anything I had ever experienced. Molly and Ruby would set out the whole tree of life in crystals on the floor, and we would all sit on the floor during the seder, read through the Haggadah, and it felt incredibly magical. Like, I just remember it feeling like such a special and unique experience. And I think that really stuck with me. Throughout my teenage years, I practiced Wicca. I followed the cycle of the year through the Wiccan calendar and observing those festivals. And I also spent a good amount of time learning Buddhist meditation and practicing that. But around college, so I went to University of California, Santa Cruz, and I studied feminism there.
Go Slugs.
Yeah, yeah, go Slugs.
Banana slugs, for those out there who are confused. One of the greatest mascots in all of the land.
I'm so proud to be a banana slug. So yeah, feminist studies was a very rigorously critical discipline. And yeah, it really kind of disrupted my spiritual identity. Like, we did not talk about spirituality or religion other than to kind of be critical of it. It kind of left me feeling like I wasn't able to be spiritual if I wanted to be political and if I wanted to be invested in feminism and anti-racist work. So after college, I found that also very dissatisfying, and I didn't feel grounded in anything. So the other thing that happened in college is that I happened to move in with a house of all Jews from LA. We just happened to live together in the dorms, and then we got a house together sophomore year. And we used to do, we started doing Shabbat together. We started doing some of the holidays together. And it just felt like home in such a wonderful way. We were eating together, making challah together, talking about our weeks together on Friday nights. And it was just such a beautiful rhythm to our life at that time. So after college, I didn't have that. I didn't feel like I could be a spiritual person in the same way, but I continued to feel drawn to ritual and to that feeling of something being greater than myself. As an adult after college, I started learning more about Judaism, and the more I learned, the more resonance I felt with the structure, the cycle of the year, and the ethical framework. And really things started to fall into place in terms of this actually might be a way of balancing my interest in activism with spirituality. When I moved to Corvallis, I really wanted to be involved in the community and to begin the conversion process, but I was so anxious to actually go to synagogue and meet people in person. But then the pandemic started, and suddenly everything was online. And suddenly I was able to engage in Judaism from my own home. And it just opened up this whole world for me of learning and being in community with other people.
So I think there's a number of really beautiful threads that come out of what you brought. I mean, first things first, I think we talk about conversion really simplistically. Tivona, you had a moment where you said, I don't think I converted from, certainly not from Christianity, but maybe not even from Buddhism, which was something that you found later. And you mentioned that you now still identify as a form of Jubu, Buddhist Jewish. And also, Holly, your story was also not like, I started not Jewish and became Jewish. It was, I started, you mentioned secular Christian, and then neo-paganism, Wicca, and then Jewish came along, lovely friends in LA. It's not this simple like, oh, I went from whatever I was born as to Jewish. Often there's other steps on the journey, and I think we miss that sometimes. Some movements, when you convert, you actually have to say that you will not continue to do the rituals, practices of the religion that you were in previously. I've struggled with that a lot as somebody who's in an interfaith relationship. And look, I'm a Jew by birth. I've never been a religious something that is not Jewish. I celebrate Christmas every year. I celebrate Easter every year. I don't think that actually does anything to, and I'm not celebrating it just as me. I'm celebrating it with my wife and her family. But whether it's Christianity, whether it's people who might, I have teachings from other religious traditions that are important to me. I don't activate them in the same ways I do Jewishly, but there are teachings from Buddhism, from Hinduism that are deeply important to me. And if I had to go in front of a room and pledge like a loyalty oath where I said, I am Jewish to the exclusion of other religious traditions, which I'm not making up that phrasing, I wouldn't want to do that. And so I guess I'm kind of curious to hear more about what did you convert from? And when you did, like, what were you doing? Were you quote unquote converting? Some people don't love that term. Were you becoming a Jew by choice? Some people also don't love that term. How might we more precisely consider what's happening when people go from not Jewish to Jewish and all the steps along the way?
For me, neither the term conversion or convert or really even Jew by choice feels like particularly satisfying. My like actual conversion itself, like that, meaning the Beit Din, the panel of rabbis who kind of interviewed me as part of my conversion, and the immersion in the mikveh, the ritual bath, that moment felt more just like an affirmation of who I had been. And there was no one point in my personal journey where I was like, oh, like now I am like, not even like internally, now I feel Jewish. It was so gradual. It really felt like as I learned and as I built up practices for myself, like including Shabbat and rituals and the Seder plate project that I do, conversion itself felt like an affirmation more than any kind of change.
I think the words that I've used, it felt like an integration. It just felt like I was integrating something new into who and what I was already, not replacing anything. One of the things Rabbi Setcher recommended when I called him and said, what do I do now with this urge to explore Judaism? And he said, you and your husband should attend a 12-week classes for prospective converts. We were in Chicago at that time. And the class that we were in was team taught. There was a Reform rabbi and a conservative rabbi. And the class, I don't know, 20-ish some people, was about half and half older folks like myself who had sort of through their own spiritual journey had come to this place of wanting to learn more. And the other half were these young couples. Now, nobody said this, but the sense was they were there because somebody said, we won't marry you, unless whoever converts. We were in week 7, something like that. I mean, we were past the halfway point. And the Reform rabbi was starting to talk about Hanukkah and, getting into little things around Christmas and stuff like that. And there was this young woman, to this day, my heart just breaks. She was there with her Jewish fiance. And there was something that the Reform rabbi said, and the Reform rabbi was very by the book, which the younger folks loved. And the conservative rabbi was like all over the place, which we elders loved. I mean, we loved where he would go. So it was also a very different style. But so the Reform rabbi was sort of, here's how you do Hanukkah, here's what you don't do, and laying all that out. She raised her hand and she said, does this mean I can't believe in Jesus anymore? The room went silent. it was so clear she did not have a clue what she was doing there. And that couple never came back. So I have no idea how that story finished. But I think there's something when you are converting, when you are taking on part of a new identity, a new way of being, that's part of a journey. That's not a flipping the switch. It is not flipping the switch. One of the other things I have so appreciated about the people who've been involved in my conversion, my integration journey, no one ever, except me, said anything about conversion. Ever, ever, ever. And one of the things I loved about Rabbi Setcher when he was giving me suggestions for how to figure out if Judaism, he kept saying, try it out and see if it feels authentic to you. There was no like, ooh, a convert, we're going to slot him in and check that box. There was none of that. Now, I did some of my own self-restraint. I mean, I knew that until I converted, I did not feel comfortable putting on a talis, a prayer shawl. I didn't feel comfortable having an aliyah, going up to have an honor when Torah was read. I mean, there were some things I just held back on. And then there came this time when I just knew that's what I wanted to do. And I went to the rabbi and I said, I think I want to convert. And he said, "Oy, you already are. It's just a matter of paperwork." So I think this thing about the flipping the switch is really damaging to people. And it's not true to who we are.
And I'd like to just offer like a different perspective on that, where like in my community here, Beidam, I did feel comfortable going up for aliyahs and putting on a tallis before I officially converted. And I did not feel like that was ever not okay within this community. And I'm very grateful for that. And I know people knew that I was not quote unquote officially Jewish yet. And I never felt like that was called into question.
No one in the synagogue in Chicago ever said I couldn't. This was sort of my own self-definition of how I wanted to do. And I remember then when I had made the decision to convert, I went to a friend of mine who was a skilled, she made beautiful prayer shawls, beautiful talitot. And when she put the sample one before it was done over my shoulders for that first time, I just sobbed because it did feel like that was in a way, that and the mikveh were my conversion points. It wasn't anybody saying anything. It was allowing myself to participate in these, your point, Holly, these ritual processes that were so deeply meaningful.
So for both of you, I mean, you've been really long time committed listeners of our podcast. And not just that, you've you've sent us a lot of notes. You've come to some of our programs. We've had all these moments to kibitz with you about Judaism Unbound's vision and lens. And so I really do want to give you the chance in that sort of partial co-host role or whatever you are today. Do y'all want to resonate a little bit with each other's stories? I just have a feeling that there will be deep Torah in that.
So Holly, when you were talking about when you were younger and went to the Passover Seder with the crystals, I love that. Actually, I think that's great. My first real Passover Seder wasn't until my mid-40s. But it was several months after I had met my husband. We were still courting. And he took my daughter and me to his Uncle Leon's house for Passover Seder. And Uncle Leon was this kind of old conservadox guy, long beard and everything. And there was something so powerful that took me back to the Hopi rain dances and to the other work I had done up on the Hopi and Navajo reservations. That first Seder at Uncle Leon's house, he led that Seder, and it just felt like I was being taken somewhere. A little bit different, I think, than the quality of your experience. And of course, I was older also, but I think the fact that kind of a Seder was a really powerful time in both of our journeys, I think is really important. And then when you talked about, I think it was in college, you said about that sense of community, and being with those people and making challah together. And that was another piece that really drew me to Judaism in an odd kind of way, because here I meet my husband who has not set foot in a synagogue since he was bar mitzvah. I mean, he did the most, unobservant Jew you'd ever want to meet, very strong cultural Jew, but not in that religion stuff at all. But yet he had a, quote, religious community that I, as a kind of solitary Buddhist practitioner, didn't. Now, that doesn't mean I couldn't have had a Buddhist community, but I was a single mom and I was working, and, I didn't, going to a Sangha, and it just didn't work. But here was my husband who had this big community. And it started me having to do some of my own reflection about how is it that I've been doing this practice for 25 plus years, but I feel not lonely, but just solitary. And so that idea of community was really important to me. And then you also talked about this going to the synagogue and your nervousness. My first synagogue experience was there were some friends of Henry's, my husband Henry's, who were Jewish, and they had invited us to a Shabbaton. I had no idea what a Shabbaton is. It's kind of a weekend, Friday, Saturday, sometimes Sunday, learning and worshiping and services and things like that. We go in, and the speaker was Rabbi Lawrence Kushner, who is this astonishingly amazing rabbi who has written just all of these amazing books and very spiritual and very mystical. And he was talking about this Jewish concept of God, Ein Sof, the God without limit, that sounded exactly the way my Taoist teachers talked about the Tao. I was like, it was so exciting. And then after that, it was like, ooh, synagogue. It's like, now, not all my synagogue experiences obviously have been that, but there was that click for me, that link of my Buddhist understandings and this Jewish understanding. Whoa, was just powerful.
I would love to pick up on what you said about feeling solitariness. I really felt that for much of my spiritual life, where I felt connected to the divine, but I didn't really feel particularly connected to other people. And that might have been a big turning point that happened for me in the pandemic, was that, something about being in my home, suddenly I felt like I was able to be in spaces where I could be my whole self. I could be interested in spirituality and in kind of mystical understandings of the world, and also interested in like deep intellectual conversations, and also interested in activism and working towards a better world. It was just such a relief to find other people. Like I did personally feel alone a lot of times in my spiritual life. And suddenly in these virtual spaces, I felt a sense of togetherness that I had not had access to for a long time. Early on, when I started listening to the podcast, it was truly such an expansive experience for me to listen to all the types of people you were interviewing and all the ways that they were doing Judaism. It really felt like it gave me permission to do Judaism in my own way. That was so validating for me on my journey.
I was actually talking to my wife yesterday about some folks that we've been in touch with who recently converted to Judaism, and apparently it's because they started listening to Judaism Unbound a lot and got really into it. And my wife said to me, like, I don't quite get it. Don't they find it a little confusing, a little insidery? And I'm like, well, we're not trying to make it insidery. She's like, yeah, but still, when you listen to it, like there's a lot of, you kind of have to be really into it to really be inside of all the conversations. And I said to her, apparently not. And I am curious about the experience of not the podcast per se, but what I'm curious about is the experience of somebody who is relatively new to Judaism, or not necessarily relatively new in time, but came to Judaism via Unbound Judaism or some other way, and then discovered Unbound Judaism. And sometimes I feel like we can be implicitly or often explicitly critical of elements of Judaism and of the Jewish community on this podcast. And I'm just curious about the experience of coming into something that is churning, right? I mean, that even though that we're particularly talking about the particular time in which we're living in Jewish history, that it's a time of disruption and churn. And you could imagine a lot of people saying, let me wait till it settles down and then I'll decide whether or not to come in. But there's people that are definitely coming, I think, because of the churn. And I'm kind of wondering, like, the two of you are among my favorite Jews. And I'm wondering if there are 300 million non-Jews in America, and like the two that needed this found it, or there's actually millions and millions of folks out there who are just like the two of you and would really connect in deep ways just as you have. And then my question, and then I have a crisis of self-confidence, right? Because then I'm like, how do we get this to them? How do we make this available?
So I just want to say one of my Jewish Buddhist links, there's a name of God, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, and it's the name that God identified as to Moses from the burning bush. And it's often translated, I am what I am. But my preferred translation is, I am becoming what I am becoming, which for me linked to my Buddhist practice of, with every breath, I am becoming different. I am no longer who I was the breath before. I loved your word, Dan, churn. That is what life is. When we get stagnant, when we get too rigid, that is when power arises. The rigidity, and the people who love that rigidity then want that rigidity to stay for power. I think that goes way back to, I don't know, episode 3 or something in B'nai Lappi's master story. Everything is in process. We as humans are in process. Judaism is in process. Our world is in process. The environment's everything is in process. But I think that process of churning is what our life is. We are becoming and becoming and becoming and becoming. And Judaism Unbound says, oh, look at all the things that you can become.
I feel like this is just such an exciting time to be Jewish. That might be a perspective that's unique to me coming into this as someone who didn't grow up Jewish, because rather than feeling disorganized, I think a big aspect for me is getting to be creative. I am also involved with the Jewish Studio Project. I just completed my creative facilitator training, and tapping into creativity, not just in terms of like visual art or writing, but truly like getting to be creative with Judaism itself, and with like looking at an old ritual or an old tradition and being able to see something that I can expand there, like seeing a little kernel that can expand and unfold into something new that feels really exciting for myself and clearly for other people too. It's just such a wonderful, wonderful thing.
Holly, I think it might be good for you to kick this one off. I mean, I was excited when Dan brought up that churning word and the idea of Judaism in process, because you seem to like things called project. You, through the Jewish Studio Project, have done this creative facilitator training, and you launched a thing on Instagram called the Seder Plate Project. So you're into projects. And that seems to tie to me to this notion of being part of something that is churning, that is in process, that is becoming, to use Tivona's Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh language. I love what you just brought, Tivona. Part of me wants to hear, even we've already talked a little bit about that, but like a little more. But to get to the specifics of those projects, they're not just called projects. They're called Jewish Studio Project and Seder Plate Project. Like you, both of you, became Jewish, and you did not remain Jewish spectators. You did something that I think is sometimes a real challenge for folks who convert. You either received permission from others or granted yourself the permission to not only be a Jew, but lead Jews in different ways, or walk with Jews, serve Jews in particular ways. And I want to hear from that. And so, Holly, I'm curious to hear more about the Seder Plate Project and the Jewish Studio Project, and not like what are they so much, but like why you felt called to those particular areas, and to the extent that that ties to your journey from not Jewish to Jewish. I know, like you said, the particular language of it, we're not sure. And Tivona, you are a chaplain. You've served people as a chaplain, as a spiritual director, and there, I mean, I'll be blunt. I think in every field of Jewish anything, we need people who began their lives as not Jews. I think that's true across the board, but I think for chaplaincy, for serving people in moments when they're dealing with tragedy, with pain, with trauma, we especially need folks who have walked different religious paths, who have begun not Jewish and became Jewish, who have that lens of, and Holly, in the way that you were talking about, like, of really having this excitement and energy about Judaism, but also being able to relate and speak with those who are not. And so to both of you, I guess I'd love to hear a little bit about the specific service you offer the world and Jews. How do you and how do other Jews by choice maybe have, I've been using the language of superpowers, like how might we really need people in those worlds who are Jews by choice? And the last question I have, and you can ignore this one and just talk about the first one if you want, but I just want to get it into the space. Both of you spoke about finding Judaism as an adult. I found Judaism as an adult, honestly. And I know a lot of people who are Jews by birth whose story of Jewish childhood, I mean, yeah, I was involved with Jewish institutions. I liked my Jewish camp. I don't have like a really bad, harmful story, but I'm kind of asking myself, like, there's different genres in the bookstore, and some genres are more for certain age groups and other genres are more for other age groups. I guess I'm kind of wondering, might it be that Judaism is just better for adults? Like, and if it were, would that be the worst thing? Like, if somebody really studied different religions and was like, wow, there's different religions with different strengths, and like Judaism, 15 and up, that's the label on the box. But it's a really great thing for 15 and up. Like, would that be like an indictment of Judaism? Like, oh, well, I guess we have done nothing. We haven't created something that's good for kids. Like, we need to do that. Maybe that is the best. But like, could it also be like, you know, a lot of folks seem to have better adult Jewish experiences than child Jewish experiences. Might we learn something from that? So mostly talk about your work in the world and the superpowers, but also that piece if you'd like.
The Seder Plate project really came out of a desire to learn and a desire to connect to the natural world around me. And at first, truly, it was just a fun thing for me to do. Briefly, what it is every month for Rosh Chodesh, which is the beginning of each Jewish month, I create a Seder style plate. So it's a plate with different plants or foods on it. And then I take a picture of it. And the plants are just things that I find walking around in my neighborhood, noticing like what's changing with the seasons. But it really became a way to learn about the cycle of the Jewish year and involve not just cycles of growth and decline in the natural world, but also internally, cycles of introspection and turning inward as we approach the high holidays, cycles of expansion and being connected to community and to social justice in the spring. This project has really been about learning that. What has been incredible for me about it is that other people are interested in it also. So I started posting these photos on Instagram and writing just a little bit about.
And we'll throw some photos in the show notes so people can get a sense. But just to really, like, you have gorgeous Seder plates for each month of the Jewish calendar year. And just for examples, for folks who are curious, go to our website.
Thank you. It's been so wonderful to, be able to create a little virtual community of people who are interested in learning with me, providing their feedback to me. And yeah.
For me, when I hear Seder, it's Passover, and to some extent, there's a notion of a Tu B'Shvat Seder. Like, I grew up having a Seder every year, and it's not that I couldn't say, oh yeah, we should have a Seder plate. Seder plate's a cool thing, and we should do it for other ones of the year. But like, I didn't do that. And I think a lot of people who are Jewish by birth, they're anchored in like, oh, Seder is a specific thing, so it lives in this time of the year, and I'm not going to throw it the rest of the year. I want to like say, you having the life experience you have, I think it lends itself to the unique awesomeness that you're naming here.
Yeah, I feel like I was able to, I don't know, see something that was already there in Judaism and again, just kind of expand it into a larger practice that worked really well for my own spirituality and for my own learning and for other people.
So when I met my husband, Henry, we were in our mid-years. So I was in my mid-40s, he was in his mid-50s. And what that meant is the first 7 years of our marriage, we were basically escorting our elders through illness and death. We lost a loved one basically once a year for the first 7 years of our marriage. And I had never had really any encounter with death and dying to that point. I mean, blessed life I had led to not have that until my mid-40s. What I found, though, is when we would be in, hospital rooms or wherever with our loved ones, I found, and I think that was my Buddhist practice, that I had the capacity to just sit and be with them, to breathe with them. My husband was off doing battle, so we were a good pair together. Actually, he was off doing battle with, medical staff and insurance companies and facility managers and all that kind of stuff. But I was just present. And what I started noticing that was new to my awareness is that most of the people, other people who would come in and out of those rooms, it's like if they couldn't do something, if they couldn't talk to somebody, then they were out, they were gone, or they kept wanting something to happen instead of just being with the process of whether it was dying, whether it was suffering, whether it was being in pain, whether it was whatever it was. I then became a hospice volunteer and met and got to work with these amazing chaplains. And I just said, that's what I want to be when I grow up. At whatever point that is, a mid-40s person saying, when I grow up, that's what I want to be. And the other thing I saw was one of my very first patients when I was a hospice volunteer was a Jewish woman dying of lung cancer. And I was visiting her, I don't know, the second time or something. And in walks the chaplain, who is this, what looks to be like a 16-year-old Catholic priest. And he walks in, it's like we're both there, and the patient said both stay. So she invited us both to stay. The other big transition for me was seeing this, he was not as young as he looked, but seeing this Catholic priest as he was getting ready to leave, sitting on her bed and saying Hebrew prayers in Hebrew to her. It was like an entirely different revelation to me of how one can be in service. And my sense then of our own beliefs, whatever they are what support us when we go in to be with people. But who they are and what they need to have present is what they need. And so I think I have been in a probably very unusual position to have grown up Christian, knowing those liturgies, knowing those hymns. I can sing Christian hymns with Christian patients. Great. They love it. They would not, and I look pretty goyish, pretty not your stereotypical Jew. And so they don't know any different. When I was doing my chaplaincy, I did not wear a kippah because I didn't want to be defined that way. I wanted to meet them where they were. It wasn't about me. People with no faith often liked some of the Buddhist practice, just the breathing or the compassion meditations or, things along those lines. And then how I would serve Jewish patients. So I was able, and I used earlier the word integrate. I feel like much of my life has been integrating things that don't usually look like they belong together, but in fact do. One of the other interesting things I think in my work that Judaism was important to for me was I worked as chaplain in two states, Washington State and Oregon State, both of whom had medical aid and dying laws way before most other states did. What I wanted to see is what was on the face of it a pretty spare, cold, sterile kind of medical act. I wanted to help people turn that into a sacred act. How does one elevate the soul to get ready for that? And for my Jewish patients and Jewish friends who asked me to be present, I created a kind of Jewish liturgy. So how do you create a liturgy to accompany people through that process? My Buddhist part of my being is what allows me to just be with people. But I think Judaism has the most profound grief and mourning rituals. So I have integrated those as well. I've been part of Tahara. Team Tahara is the washing of the dead body in preparation for burial. I've been part of those teams. It's this blending of who I am and how I've brought both Judaism and Buddhism into that work.
So I want to pick up on what you just said, Tivona, and transition it, I think, to what's our closing question. Just my opinion of one superpower. Lex asked you about your superpowers, and just one that I heard is that there's a possibility that certain folks, it's not all folks that convert to Judaism, because I think that some listen to what they're told, and they're told you have to give up all your other affiliations, and they say, I guess I have to, and they do. But I feel there's a new breed of folks, and maybe it's not so new. Maybe they've been around for a long time. You've been around for a long time, saying that no, that actually the superpower that I bring is my capacity to, like you said, to integrate, to not accept this binary of Jew and non-Jew. That itself feels to me like a superpower. I wanted to just as a closing question ask you kind of two things. One, I don't mean this question to say, how is Judaism better than other religions? I definitely am not trying to ask that. What I'm trying to ask is, especially for those of us who grew up Jewish and are sometimes disgruntled, what are the things that make one want to become Jewish? Like, what are the things that Judaism in particular does that are particularly attractive and wonderful? And I think that my other half of that question, especially, Holly, as you are about to go into rabbinical school, and Tivona, you've been a chaplain and a leader in other ways, like for a long time. And so you've already been here to some extent. But as you think about yourselves as, like Lex said earlier, leaders of Jews, what do you imagine needs to be softened, tidied up, as I sometimes talk about Marie Kondo saying, that's kind of getting in the way of the things that are beautiful about Judaism, the things that attracted you and others to Judaism, that may be the friction that makes it so that there are a lot of people out there, like I was asking earlier, who may be this is the right thing for them, but they won't get here because of various frictions.
Well, especially you talked earlier about the adult. I think for me as an adult, there was a vocabulary for things that even within Buddhism I didn't have. So I often say I went from a tradition of no words to a tradition of nothing but words. And I still struggle with that a lot, actually. But what I do like about all the wordiness of Judaism, which sometimes gets in my way, but I love Hebrew. So I love languages, and having learned Hebrew and understanding that Hebrew is this really porous language, that there's not just one way of understand, especially biblical Hebrew, of understanding what that word or what that sentence or what that portion means. And, the Talmudic teaching about, the 70 faces of Torah and turn it and turn it and turn it again. I love that. That is the invitation to churn. I mean, it's right. It's from ancient times, that invitation to churn things, to look at it again and again and again. I like that very much. And as I said earlier, I love the music piece. That speaks to a deep part of my soul. And I love those minor chords. And it opens my soul up in a way that other kinds of music don't. And then the ethical structure, and Holly, you talked about that earlier, kind of the social justice focus and the ethical focus is a large part of what drew me, as well as the calendar. It's fascinating and it changes all the time. And it's exciting. And that's part of what drew me. What I find has been stumbling blocks for me personally, and I loved that you guys had a whole unit around Israel, because it was the first time I got to hear people saying what I think about Israel, but never felt I had the guts or the right or maybe the understanding to say. It was really liberating. And I will also say that Rabbi Brant Rosen was on my Bet Din.
Oh, nice.
So
we'll do a show note to his episode. Perfect.
So that connection, because not only did I not grow up I grew up not knowing anything about Israel. That it just was not on my family's radar. I don't remember Israel ever being talked about. It was an utter unknown. And really, when I first started hearing about it was when, the rabbi in his due diligence with a convert said, you need to know that your conversion will not be accepted in Israel. And I have to say, well, okay, then doesn't mean anything to me. I'm not going. Why would I do that? And then I'm pretty pro-Palestinian, actually. So I have often felt like I can't say what I really think, and especially as, someone who works in a clergy role. So hearing those interviews in your unit on Israel was freeing for me. But I think that can be an impediment, and then, all of the interviews you've had with people who've come out of Orthodoxy, I think that too, there's an understanding or maybe a stereotyping or perception of that sense of rigidity. And I think for some, it's great. That's what they're looking for. But for others, it's not.
Things that are great about Judaism. I think Judaism provides so many technologies of connection. Yes, there are traditions. Yes, there are kind of expectations about how to do things. But kind of like overarching all of these are these ways of being in connection with other people, like Havruta, like learning in pairs, where coming together, bringing two minds or two ideas together to create something new. That is such a big aspect of it for me. And as Tivona also mentioned, the cycle of the year has been such a powerful way to live my life, following the cycle of the Jewish year. One of the things I love most about it is I know everything will come around again. Because it will come around again the next year, I know I don't have to do everything or be everything. This is not my one shot at it. And when it does come around the next year, I will be in a different place and I'm approaching the same text or the same ritual from this new place. And it allows me to find something new in that. So I will say I have surprised myself over the last several years by really loving Torah. I mean, really loving reading the 5 books of Moses and the Torah cycle, reading the Parsha each week. And, so much of it is very upsetting and has done a lot of damage. I don't know. I think that we really have to continue to reckon with that. And I think that shows up in big ways in Israel-Palestine, as Tivona was talking about. And I think it shows up even in small ways in synagogues and local communities, especially when people of color are members of our communities. We still have a lot of work to do.
There's no better way to close a Judaism Unbound episode than with work to do to confront oppressive norms in our Jewish communities, beyond them. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation. Thanks so much for having it.
It was fabulous being here. And Holly, so great to meet you, and blessings on your move to the other coast.
Thank you, all of you, so much. Tivona, it was wonderful to talk to you, and I look forward to what's next for us.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. A reminder, we have 5, not 1, 2, 3, or 4, 5 full semester courses being offered on Yeshiva that you are going to see and say, oh my gosh, I got to take them. You can find out what they are at judaismunbound.com/classes. We'll also be giving you a little more information in the coming weeks, so stay tuned. But registration is open. You should head to judaismunbound.com/classes and sign up. Also, of course, we want to close out this conversation by encouraging you to be in touch with us, and there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram pages. All of those are at Judaism Unbound for our handles. Second, there's our website, judaismunbound.com, where you can find show notes for this episode and all sorts of other resources. judaismunbound.com for that. And there are our email addresses, dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. Hit us up there with any comments, questions, visions, dreams, arguments, whatever you got. So thank you so much. The last request we have is that we appreciate when you are able to support us financially with a one-off donation or a recurring monthly donation. And you can do either of those at judaismunbound.com/donate. So thanks to all of you so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.